Ukraine has taken this long. They think that if you're going to go to war, you should go to war. In other words, everything should be mobilized. Everything in the country should be committed to winning the war and ending it on terms that meet Russian needs. But the key point is winning it and ending it. This thing has gone on in the view of many, many Russians too long. That's not just the man in the street. That's people in his inner circle. That's people in the government. So now he's come out and said, well, now we're getting ready to go to war. Well, what's changed? Ukraine is not recovering. In fact, the latest figures I've received from multiple sources, including those in Eastern Europe, of people that have been watching this carefully, is that 265,000 Ukrainians have been killed just within the last 6 months. In other words, January through June. We're talking about 265,000 Ukrainian troops. This would bring the total of losses up to probably 1.7, 1.8 million.
Wow.
We find that incomprehensible, but I'm afraid it's not. And anybody who knows what real war is like knows from historical experience that's not outrageous. What's interesting is that the losses on the Russian side have been so minimal. And we think they may have lost 120, 130,000 killed, but that's starting back in 2022. Well, there's reasons for that, and we've discussed that before. Armies in retreat that are disintegrating, falling apart, they tend to take much heavier losses. Most of the German losses in World War II occurred in the last 9 months of the war, when things were falling apart and disintegrated. So that should not surprise us, but it does surprise a lot of people. Now, what does all of this mean? There's something else that's happening. President Putin and his leadership were understandably very focused on Ukraine. And being so focused on Ukraine, I think they took their eye off the ball in the Caucasus. They weren't watching carefully what Mr. Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, was up to. I don't think they really worried about it because Aliyev's father, who was a KGB major general, a member of the Politburo, and was viewed as absolutely loyal to both the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia, suggested there was nothing to worry about in Azerbaijan. Well, that's turned out to be wrong. The Azeris have formed a very close relationship with Israel, and that relationship also includes Greater Turkey, in other words, Mr. Erdogan. But primarily Israel and Erdogan and the United States all share a similar interest right now in Azerbaijan. That is to destabilize and harm Iran in any way possible. Well, what's the worst thing that could happen to Iran? Well, the worst thing that could happen to Iran is for the Iranian country, the nation itself, to break up. And we know for a very long time that Iran has had various pockets of nationalities, though well integrated and part of the Iranian national state and society, they nevertheless still exist. And that includes the Azeri Turkic population in northwestern Iran. There is now a definite, deliberate, conscious, use whatever terms you want, plan to invade northern Iran by Azerbaijan in the hopes of raising a rebellion in northwestern Iran, centered around Tabriz, which is the center of the Turkic population in northwestern Iran. There are lots of Azeris in Iran who are currently interested in this. So the threat to Iran is very real. That's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that Azerbaijan was already offering or providing a platform for use by the Mossad, MI6, and CIA against Iran. We're not sure how much was used. In other words, did they launch drones? Probably. But they certainly moved agents from Azerbaijan into Iran, which were then able to set up and cause havoc inside Iran during the 12-day war. So this is part of the problem. And then you have to look further to the west at Syria, understand that Syria is basically part of Greater Turkey. Everything that happens in Syria happens because Mr. Erdogan wants it to or doesn't want it to. Jolani is not an independent agent. He is a figurehead. And Erdogan, for the moment, wants to get along with the Jewish state. However, there are limitations to his cooperation.
And I'm sorry, Doug, Jelani is a figurehead, and who's pulling his strings?
Erdogan. Jelani is just a figurehead in Syria that we, the Israelis, MI6, in other words, US CIA, and Erdogan installed.